All right, so we're going to talk about psychological disorders here, and we see ourselves with Homer Simpson going crazy. So you got to admit that was a good episode. Okay, so I want to talk about the models or the ways that people view psychological disorders. Turns out there's three different ways that people can view psychological disorders, and that would be the supernatural view, the psychological approach, and the medical model. And these three different ways of viewing are not mutually exclusive. But obviously, if you go back long, you find cavemen, they used a supernatural approach to mental disorders. If somebody was exhibiting mental disorders, it was because that they were demon had possessed them potentially, right? As we find the same kind of supernatural approach to mental disorders throughout the Middle Ages, even, and coming up into, say, the Salem witch trials, may be a good example of the supernatural approach to mental disorders being manifested. And so the supernatural approach to mental disorders leads to a lot of shame from mental disorders. Because if a mental disorder is caused by a demon, and you have a mental disorder and I don't, well, then there's something fundamentally wrong with you, right? Because a demon chose to possess you, but didn't choose to possess me, right? So there's something wrong with you. Well, later on in the history, people such as Philippe Pinel, Dorothea Dix, many others, Benjamin Rush, they came in and they kind of said, hey, you know what? Psychological disorders really seem to be the result of the stresses of living, more of a psychological approach. And so it's the stress of interacting with others, the stress of the modern world, these things that are creating psychological disorders. And so under Philippe Pinel and these others, what they found was that treatments for mental disorders involved things such as rest, stress reduction, things of this nature. But then later on in the late 19th century, one physician, I don't even know who did this, discovered the connection between syphilis and mental disorder. So long-term syphilis leads to brain deterioration. And so there was this literal connection between a medical disorder, syphilis, and a mental disorder, the deterioration of functioning that occurred. And so the medical model arose, and it was an interesting model because it thinks about mental disorders just like physical disorders, things that should be diagnosed, things that can be treated, things that can be fixed, okay? And so it's a different perspective. And clearly, nobody holds one of these models exclusive of the other two. And different people, different societies, different cultures, different times have leaned on these three different approaches to varying degrees across time. So, putting some words together, diagnosis is an important word. A diagnosis is simply a label, okay, to distinguish one from another, right? Etiology is the cause and history of what's happened. But prognosis is very, very important in the world of mental health. Prognosis is the expectations for what a disease will look like moving forward. Okay, so the reason that diagnoses are important is because they allow for prognoses. In the past, people that had the diagnosis of fill in the blank with a disorder tended to have this outcome occur. Therefore, my best guess is if you are now diagnosed with this mental disorder, this is what will happen to you. Okay, so it's important. So what is it that defines a mental disorder? And this is a problematic thing. Some people say deviance, okay? But if somebody has green spiked hair and shaved on the sides, they're very deviant, but is that a disorder? No, probably not. So the best way I think to think about mental disorders is to see, I'm a big fan of evolution and adaptation. And our behaviors are designed to adapt us to our environment. And so if you have something, a disorder of some kind, that is interfering with your ability to perform those adaptive behaviors, then it's a mental disorder. I mean, that to me is a way to distinguish it. And so, yeah, anyway, normal and abnormal exist on a continuum, however, and that's for sure. It turns out that it turns out that the biggest way that mental disorders are discussed is using the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's currently in the 5th edition. And what happens is that the DSM, and I mean, I'm going to completely simplify it, but the DSM, what it does is it breaks down different categories of mental disorders. And we'll talk about some of these, but mood disorders, anxiety disorders, substance-related disorders, dissociative, factitious. So a fascinating group of categories of disorders. But what happens in most of these cases is there's going to be a list of a diagnostic category. And it's like, in order to be considered to have this mental disorder, and then often what they'll do is they'll have a list of like 8 symptoms, and it'll be, must manifest 5 or more of these symptoms for 6 months or longer, something like that. And so all of a sudden, if you manifest 4 of them and not 5 of them, you don't fit the bill. I mean, clearly you've got problems. You've got 4 out of 8 symptoms, but you haven't crossed that threshold into the category that the DSM calls disorder. So clearly, psychological disorders do fall along a continuum, and if you look at all of the symptoms in the DSM, no matter how psychologically healthy you are, you're going to exhibit a good handful of those things. So I'll talk about a couple of the largest categories of mental disorders briefly. Anxiety disorders are disorders characterized by feelings of worry, apprehension, anxiety, and there's a lot of different forms of anxiety disorders, okay? Generalized anxiety disorder is this feeling of anxiety that you have in all contexts, okay? Most anxiety disorders, there's going to be something that is triggering the anxiety. Let's say in a phobic disorder, you might be, acrophobia, fear of heights, claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, something like this. So there's a specific thing that is triggering the anxiety. But in generalized anxiety disorder, there's no environmental thing, there's no trigger, there's no thing that's create. You just have what they call free-floating anxiety. How do you deal with it? See, now, if you have a phobic disorder and if you have a fear of some, anxiety is triggered by some external event, avoid it, right? That's the most common response people with phobias do. But yet, there's nothing in generalized anxiety disorder. There's, and that's different. So when it comes to phobias, though, I love this. Martin Seligman, he did some pretty cool stuff. He talked about like when I teach the learning class, he said some things animals are born prepared to learn. Some things animals are unprepared to learn, and some things are contra-prepared to learn. And it was a kind of a neat distinction. And so he might talk about, say, for example, a pigeon. I studied pigeons in my dissertation work, so I'm familiar. A pigeon is prepared to learn how to peck at a key. Okay, they peck at little discs because the pecking is associated with food behaviors. Okay. But now that same pigeon, you could say, okay, trying to teach a pigeon to approach when there's a loud sound, because loud sounds naturally trigger a fly-away behavior. And so if you try to teach the pigeon to approach and in response to this loud sound, that's an contra-prepared. Okay, so certain things are prepared, certain things are contra-prepared. And so with phobias in humans, we find that certain learning is prepared in this way. That, say, for example, if you take, and this has been done, I like this study. Let's say you take a picture of a snake and show it to somebody, and then very quickly follow it by a short electric shock. Like that. Okay? Snake, 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 okay, just about 5 times. And then you show the picture of the snake, and all of a sudden the person will be exhibiting symptoms of anxiety. You can measure physiological reactions and whatnot. Now do the exact same study, but instead of pictures of snakes, do, like, I don't know, green square. Green square, bzz, green square, bzz, green square, bzz, green square, bzz. Nothing. You can't trigger the anxiety in response to the green square. It just doesn't work because we as humans are prepared to be afraid of snakes. A couple of other anxiety disorders would be panic disorder, which is a sudden rush of anxiety that just overwhelms you in form of a panic attack. Agoraphobia, which is, well, really a phobia, but a specific phobia, which is a problem, and that is a fear of going outside. Often panic disorder and agoraphobia work together, because what happens with panic disorders is sudden, overwhelming anxiety. And what happens is, let's say you get this anxiety when you're on the bus, and you're like, I can't control myself. You just avoid the bus. Okay, so you have a panic attack at the grocery store, and so now you start to avoid the grocery store. And pretty soon this agoraphobia emerges, and it's a fear of going out in the public as a whole. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder with these uncontrollable thoughts and obsessions and compulsions. This obsession, oh, I have to, I can't step on a crack, let's say, right? And so when I walk, I have to avoid cracks. So an obsession is stepping on a crack will lead to something bad. And a compulsion would be you must walk in such a way to avoid cracks or something. And so obsessive compulsive disorder can actually be quite major in a person's life. Like, say, a very common issue is a need for orderliness, okay? I need everything to be exactly organized. It must be, or something bad is going to happen. What bad thing is going to happen? I don't know, but something bad is going to happen. And so I have an obsession with orderliness, and so I have a compulsion to make positive that every hanger in my closet is in the same direction, spaced exactly the same apart from every other hanger. Okay? It can become a problem. Anxiety disorders seem to have some genetic basis. There is some, you see some anxiety disorders running in families. You find anxiety disorders actually being predicted very early on. Some infants are, you might want to call them high-strung or something like that. Some infants, any little sound, and they just boom, and they jump. And infants that are high-strung like this are more likely to be developing anxiety or disorders later. Clearly, anxiety disorders can be, even if they don't evolve through learning, as we had already said. Let's say I'm in an elevator and I feel anxiety, and anxiety doesn't feel good, so I get off the elevator. And as soon as I got off the elevator, the anxiety went away. Aha! I've been reinforced for the behavior of avoiding an elevator. So, learning can if not develop, definitely maintain. People that have certain worrisome thinking patterns can also, and high stress may trigger it. And so here is, this goes back to the preparedness thing of Martin Seligman. We see here that, snakes, mice being in high exposed places are likely to trigger phobic reactions. But look at this, driving a car. Driving a car doesn't really trigger a lot of phobic reaction. And I'm going to tell you, here in the 21st century, you are a whole hell of a lot more likely to die in a car accident than you are from a snake bite, okay? It just isn't going to happen. And yet people generally don't fear cars, and they should, okay? Dissociative disorders, dissociative is like a split in consciousness or something like that. And so with dissociative disorders, their consciousness becomes two parts, something. With dissociative amnesia, let's say, for example, that following a traumatic event, the mind will split apart, and then you'll have an inability to perhaps remember some portion of the traumatic event, okay? And you just can't remember it because your consciousness has separated itself. In the largest of the dissociative disorders, dissociative identity disorder, you can have the coexistence of more than two people in consciousness and flip back and forth. People with dissociative identity disorder can have like when they switch from one to the other, they can change what handed, their handedness, or they can change. One will know how to play the piano and the other personality won't, or something. But there's a lot of critics out there that believe dissociative identity disorder is a bullshit disorder, and it's really the product of therapists that create it in the laboratory or in the therapy office, right? I'm mixed on this. I think that dissociative identity disorder does exist, but I think that a true dissociative identity disorder is incredibly rare. And by far the majority of the time that people believe this exists, it was falsely created. Associated with stress, yeah, as I said, some traumatic disorder or something of this nature. Mood disorders. Mood disorders are the ones that are perhaps the most, well, no, that are the most common as far as total number of people affected. Thank you. Marked by emotional disturbances, but it can be more than that. Well, anyway, I'll get to that. There's two different types. They're called unipolar and bipolar. Polar is, of course, meaning something like extreme. So a unipolar would be one extreme. Bipolar is two extremes. So major depressive disorder is unipolar because it involves moods at one extreme only, the downs. And so what we find is that there's a lot of different symptoms of major depressive disorder, and of course a depressed mood is the largest of these things, but there's many other things as well, including, say, for example, difficulty sleeping, or perhaps sleeping too much, or psychomotor agitation or retardation. In other words, too much movement or not enough movement. Fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness. So, and loss of appetite somewhere up in here, right? And so all of a sudden it's like there's lots of symptoms above and beyond depressed mood, okay? And so it's pretty interesting. This is a way that they might categorize it. Look at this. Presence of major depressive episode, which includes 5 of the following, 5 or more during the same 2-week period, with at least one being depressed mood. So here's 9 if you have 5 or more. However, even with these categories and stuff, it says and B. Look at that. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment. Remember, as I said, my notion of adaptation and evolution, impairment. It makes it so that you can't adapt to social functioning. So then bipolar, as I say, is the two extremes, the up and the down. So the most common is called manic depressive disorder, although they often don't refer to that anymore. They just call it bipolar. And so what happens is there's depressed mood, and then there's, a manic episode where people are just hyperactive, crazy. And so we can see right here in this image, okay? Here is somebody with bipolar disorder, and you can see May 17th, they were in a depressed state. And here's a PET scan, an image of their brain, which basically shows activity. And blue means, calm and quiet, and red means active and alert. And you can see on May 17th, they were in a depressed state. On May 18th, they were in a manic state. And they must have remained in a manic state until May 27th, when they're back to a depressed state. And you can very clearly see not just, the behavioral manifestations, but the outcomes from their brain activity. Yeah, there's a lot of, there seems to be a genetic basis to all of these mental disorders. But they talk about a concordance rate. They're talking about, say, for example, if one identical twin has clinical depression, will the other identical twin? That's kind of what they mean by that. And so clearly, though, there's different areas of the brain that are impacted by, and what we find is that in depression, unipolar depression, what you find is that the brain often has low levels of serotonin. Serotonin is that neurotransmitter in the brain that's responsible for feelings of pleasure, right? but serotonin is also related to sleep regulation and appetite. And so lo and behold, all three symptoms, mood, appetite, and sleep problems, all linked together to depression because, of course, it's all being triggered by the serotonin problems. And of course, there are some thinking patterns or cognitive issues like learned helplessness. We talked about Martin Seligman's learned helplessness with his dogs earlier. And pessimistic explanatory style, thinking over and over and over and over, ruminating. Um, Often what triggers? There we go. Interpersonal factors, poor social skills. Yeah, strong link between stress. Yeah, that's pretty common. All right, now schizophrenic disorders is an interesting category. Schizophrenic disorders is not a split in the consciousness, but a split from reality. Okay, so dissociative identity disorders are a split in consciousness, whereas schizophrenic is a split from reality. So what happens is schizophrenic disorders are a pretty broad group. They really manifest quite a lot of different ways. And so it's often motor disturbances, or thought disturbances, or a lot of different problems. You find, of course, all of the mental disorders seem to have a genetic component, but of them, schizophrenia seems to be the most solidly linked to genetics. All right, that it seems to be like the children, if both parents have schizophrenia, there is an incredibly high likelihood that the children will as well. So it's of all of them. You find it at a very similar rate all over the world. See, unlike all of these other disorders I mentioned, there's a lot of cultural variation in etiology and in prognosis and in manifestation but schizophrenia is schizophrenia in a lot of ways. There's much less of the variability involved. It tends to be in early adolescence or early adulthood rather, and there's two different kinds. It can be a gradual onset or a sudden onset. And so we find that sudden onset let's say there's two main biological issues that are going on with schizophrenia. Number one is dopamine problems. That dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and too much dopamine will create schizophrenic type symptoms. Coincidentally, cocaine also triggers excess dopamines essentially, and so the effect of cocaine and the effect of schizophrenia have some overlap between them. But you find also that schizophrenia results in or is the result of brain abnormalities, in particular a shrunken brain. What happens is the brain tissue just shrinks back, leaves some empty space or fluid-filled ventricles in the brain. And so what we find is that usually if the onset is gradual, that's probably the result of brain shrinking, and there ain't much treatment for that. But if the symptoms are the result of are much more sudden onset, that's more likely to be more of a dopamine dysregulation, which can be at least in some ways controlled. Okay, but yeah, look at the list of symptoms down here. Irrational thinking, delusions, right? Mistaken beliefs. Oh, I'm, an important person that I'm not, or something. A deterioration of adaptive behaviors. There's the word adaption again. Okay? Distorted perceptions, hallucinations, things of this nature. And here's the image. If you've got an identical twin with schizophrenia, what's the likely you're going to get it? And you can see that there's a pretty solid genetic basis here in all of these different cultures. So there's different ways that schizophrenia might look. The most common in the United States is paranoid schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia is marked most obviously by delusions of persecution. That is like people are out to get me. I have to be very careful. Somebody's watching or something of this nature. Catatonic schizophrenia is much more of a slowdown, just like a stopping. Okay, Whereas disorganized schizophrenia is almost like a just everything is out of control. Catatonic is like a stop. And so we can talk about positive symptoms and negative symptoms. A positive symptom is something that is present that shouldn't be there. A negative system is something that isn't present that should be there. So disorganized schizophrenia tends to have a lot of positive symptoms, whereas catatonic schizophrenia is primarily negative symptoms. Okay? But some people have undifferentiated because they don't fit cleanly in one of these three categories. So as I said, in the United States, paranoid schizophrenia is by far the most common form. But if you go to, say, India, for example, again, they have schizophrenia at the same rate as people in the United States. But when they experience schizophrenia, it's almost always catatonic schizophrenia. So a different culture, different manifestation of the same genetic thing. Oh my, there's a lot of different words for you to enjoy. Where does it come from? Again, yeah, a lot of genetics. But, and yeah, and it's too much dopamine in the brain. But I mean, where does that come from? So, neurological, neurodevelopmental. Yeah, the brain, the infant brain, while it's developing in the womb, can in fact get disrupted. And there's evidence that the rate of schizophrenia, for example, and I don't remember the exact dates, but if a baby is developing during cold and flu season, so let's say February. So if an infant is in I think it's about the fourth month of gestation, and so if the baby is born in, what is that, February? March, April, May, June, July. There you go. Baby's born in July in America, and I could be wrong on the exact dates on this, so don't get all panicky on me. But those that were at a critical stage in gestation during the cold and flu season are more likely to develop schizophrenia later. And yet, if you go to the southern hemisphere where their seasons flip, you find the exact same pattern, but the opposite direction, right? Because their cold and flu season would not be in February; theirs would be in July, right? And so all of a sudden, boom, 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 they get their own pattern. But it's pretty powerful that there's a relationship there. I find this to be a very cool slide, one of my favorites. And so you've got people with schizophrenic symptoms. Let's say, just say for example, hey, there's a guy and he thinks the dog's talking to him. Why do you think it's true? So they asked people in Great Britain and in Saudi Arabia, with Britain in red and Saudi Arabia in green. And so you can see that the most common responses for the British sample, oh, the reason he thinks that the dog is talking to him is, oh, he's got schizophrenia and he's under stress, okay? But take a look at the sample here from Saudi Arabia. What's the most common response? That's Satan's voice. They're cursed. Oh, oh wow. So you can see that the Western sample here from Britain is much more likely to have more of a medical or a psychological view of mental disorders, whereas a Saudi sample here was much more likely to express more beliefs in a supernatural view. Some other disorders, eating disorders. Eating disorders are interesting. Severe disturbances in eating behaviors, characterized by preoccupations with weights, unhealthy efforts. There's three main forms of eating disorders: anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating. And so we find they all have similarities, but they're expressed by different people. Anorexia is this intense fear of gaining weight, and it usually is adolescent females. In fact, all of these are almost exclusively females, but men, unfortunately, are getting eating disorders a lot more than they used to because of the, what do we call it, the metrosexual, right? Now, this is a new thing. Maybe it's an old thing now, but I mean, new to me, right? But this idea of the metrosexual that needs to be, clean shaven and everything, what does it mean to be a man all of a sudden? And so all of a sudden these disorders are arising in men. But primarily, historically, it's been females. And so what happens is girls will refuse to eat, okay? And so when they refuse to eat, well, the body needs calories. So the body's going to start to, consume muscle tissue, because there's protein in muscle tissue. So all of a sudden the muscles are going to shrivel away. And often these girls will believe, okay, I'm still fat, so I got to keep starving myself. And inevitably, the body needs to consume calories, and eventually will consume the heart of the person with anorexia and create all kinds of heart problems and eventually death. Okay, so definitely we need some interventions to work on this. Bulimia is a similar thing, but it's different. Bulimia is characterized by binging and purging, and that is often, again, and it's often females, late adolescent or something, that are perpetually on a diet and feel guilty, right? And so you fall to the temptation and you eat an Oreo, and then you go, oh my God, I cheated on my diet, so what the hell? I might as well just eat the whole bag of Oreos. And then you finish the entire bag of Oreos, and then all of a sudden the guilt sets in. And so I guess I have a solution, and out it all comes. And so it's a combination of binging and purging, although purging can also involve X-lax or what would you call them? X-lax. I'll just leave it at X-lax. Or perhaps excessive exercise sessions, a bag of Oreos followed by 10 hours of working out or something of this nature. Problems with that, obviously, because vomiting too often can chew up the throat and kill the teeth and all kinds of crap. Binge eating disorder is basically eating in huge binges without the purging, and it's usually 2, 3, 4, 5,000 calories in one sitting. And what happens is that and it's interesting because my understanding is binge eating disorder almost always occurs at night. And so people with binge eating disorder, they'll be overweight, probably significantly overweight, and people will be like, but you don't eat anything. I mean, at lunch you eat a tiny little bitty salad, and I don't see you snacking, and what's going on? And because it's at 2 in the morning. Eating disorders, as we said, they've probably been around for a long time, but they've become much more common recently, especially with the introduction of Western media. Western media that promotes, the Barbie doll image. What do I know? But I've been told that if you look at the proportions of a Barbie doll, it's almost impossible for a human being to achieve, and yet we're giving little girls these Barbie dolls and saying this is the standard of beauty to which you must achieve. So yeah, it's not a surprise that eating disorders come up. Where do these come from? Again, there is some genetic basis, but less so than in some of these other disorders. Family pressure can really be a factor. It does run in families, but it seems to be because of the pressure from the family, not the genetic from the family. Other factors can possibly, yeah. Well, there's many other disorders as well. One of these categories is personality disorders, and personality disorders are characterized by, there's many forms of personality disorders, as you can see on this slide: narcissistic, schizoid, schizotypal. But they all have in common one thing: a personality disorder is a type of personality or way of responding or a way of interacting with others that is not healthy, that does not lead to. So a narcissistic personality disorder is somebody that is so obsessed with themselves and how great they are that in all social interactions it's always got to be about me, 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 me. And so clearly it's going to create problems in social settings. So generally speaking, people with personality disorders tend to have the exact same problems in social settings across their lifetime, and it repeats and it repeats and it repeats. But what's also in common with personality disorders is that almost all cases of personality disorders, there's this belief by the person with the disorder that the problem is not me, the problem is you. And so if you've got a very specific problem with one boyfriend, and then you get a second boyfriend, and you get the same specific problem, and you get a third boyfriend, and you get the same specific problem, It's not boyfriend 1, 2, and 3. It's you, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. But of these personality disorders, the one that scares me the most is antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial is one of them, and antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a lack of compassion. Okay, that is to say, let's say a mass murderer. Oh, he's on death row, mass murderer, whatever. And here's the deal: this mass murderer, generally speaking, they make a distinction between, for mom. Okay, they're like, mom falls into a special category, and I wouldn't. People with antisocial mom does not fall into a special category. Okay, if mom has $50, I need $50. I'm just gonna take it from mom. Okay, what do I care? And so there's absolutely no empathy. And see, this is not exactly true. There's two different forms of empathy. There's cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And so cognitive empathy is the ability to understand another's feelings. Emotional empathy is caring about it. And so people with antisocial personality disorder will often have very high cognitive empathy. They'll be able to understand what you're feeling. They'll be able to put themselves in your shoes, and they'll understand exactly how their behavior will affect you, but they won't care. Okay? That's a dangerous combination. So what you see here is a very fascinating image of a murderer and a normal person. And you can see here that this is a brain scan taken, from the top. So in the, at the top of these images is what would be called the frontal lobes, right here. And so we can see, and again, dark red means lots of activity, blue means kind of shut down or something like that. And we can see the frontal lobes of these murderers, there's almost no activity. And what that does is that frontal lobe allows people to understand the consequences of their actions or something, to foresee them. So clearly there's some actual brain differences here, but I'm really scared. I remember there was one mass murderer one time, Edward O'Toole, I think it was, and he had antisocial personality disorder. And he when he finally got arrested, he was interviewed, and he says basically, I think about killing like I think about smoking. It's just a habit. It's just something you do. I'm like, wow, okay, that scares the bejesus out of me. So when it comes to mental disorders, now all of a sudden you got to think about the legal system. In a court of law, say for example, if a and we see these all the time, like a 2-year-old is playing with a gun and they shoot their little brother. Well, you can't convict a 2-year-old of a crime because the 2-year-old had no ability to comprehend that the behaviors that they were exhibiting could lead to those consequences. Okay, so it's just crazy thought to even consider it. Well, if you take that same line of reasoning forward, if a mental disorder has diminished your capacity to comprehend that the actions that you have done would in fact lead to those consequences, how can we, just like we can't charge a 2-year-old, how can we charge somebody with a mental disorder? Well, this becomes difficult. This notion of not guilty by reason of insanity, which is very rare, by the way. Courts don't like to give this because victims want somebody to be punished. I don't care if they don't understand what the hell they did. My brother's dead. I want justice. All right, and so clearly there's something there. But what we find is that, look at this, 16% of inmate populations have severe, not just like depression or something, severe mental disorders. And so clearly there's some connection here, and it's slipping through the cracks. But one of the most interesting examples was a guy named Larry Robeson. Larry Robeson was clearly paranoid schizophrenic with characteristics of disorganized schizophrenia, kind of a combination. And Larry Robeson was just kind of weird. He was homeless. Almost inevitably, people with schizophrenia kind of lose all social ties and connections. So Larry Robeson is basically homeless, and he's basically shits on people's doorsteps, things like this. And so people call the police, oh, Larry's pooping on my front door. I think we need to take care of this place. So Larry is rounded up by the police, taken to the mental hospital. They get him settled out on his, they bring him in, they get all of his symptoms cleared up with medication, okay? He's medicated. Send him back out, okay? Well, Larry Robeson is homeless. He's got no family to help him keep track of his medicines. Once the medicines that he was given at the hospital are gone, how many homeless people know how to fill a prescription, right? I mean, what's he? And almost inevitably, what happens is he's off his meds and he's acting crazy again. And so they do this with Larry back and forth and back and forth, and he's in and he's out and he's in and he's out. And one time he's out and he kills a little girl. Okay? Killed her. And so now it's like, okay, clearly Larry did not know what he was doing. Okay? But whose fault is it? Is it Larry's fault? He literally committed the act. Is it, the insurance company's fault because they wouldn't pay for any more treatment for him? Is it society's fault because we didn't take care of our most vulnerable citizens? I mean, who's to blame? Somebody has to be blamed. And so it's an interesting question when it comes to mental disorders and personal responsibility. All right, so we've got one topic left, and we'll get to that maybe tomorrow. Maybe I've had enough for today. So maybe tomorrow I'll come back and see you for topic 15.